speak. I prepared my lecture this morning because I had prepared it a few weeks ago, but then I changed everything. And it's not too indifferent than walking into the studio with an idea or a thought, and then you completely turn a different direction. And I've learned over the years that this is my nature, of making a left or right turn away from something or a place or something that I'm making. And I've learned to trust it as much anxiety as it sometimes presents myself, because you don't really know, in a sense, where you're going. It always comforts me at the end of it because I realize that I'm touching on something that I feel closer to and not something that is too planned out. I'm not a big planner. You can probably tell by how I'm dressed. I moved to New York in 1984 from Los Angeles. To give you a little bit of context and background about my upbringing, which I think is important. My father is Australian. My mother is Irish, so I was born in Melbourne, Australia. And we immigrated when I was 3 years old to California, to Santa Monica. And then after about 3 years, we bought a house, my parents bought a house, in a small suburb about 45 minutes north of Los Angeles, a tract home, and we lived on a cul-de-sac. There were no museums, there was really no place for a young kid to go look at art. It really didn't exist there at all. But there was a different kind of culture at play, and that what I had found years later to be something quite valuable to me. And I'll give you a short little story, and one of many little stories that I'll share with you this evening. When I did come to New York many years later, and I had my first gallery, and I had my first interview with a critic. Robert Pincus Witten was coming to interview me. And I must say that I really didn't know anything about him. I really didn't know much about the art world at all. I studied at Art Center College of Design, but I studied illustration. And it wasn't until I was through school that I realized that my nature was not for an illustrator, but for something else. Something that I learned later would be called a painter. But I didn't know much. I was sort of out of the park, and I didn't know the language of really anything that was going on. So my gallerist, like all good gallerists do, he presented me all the books that Robert Pincus Witten had written the night before the interview, hoping that I could read them and charm him with my knowledge of what he had written. Obviously, I didn't do that. But I was nervous, and I really didn't trust my own nature and my own stories, but that's all I had to give. So that's what I did. I just told stories of what I do and what I did at that time and how I arrived at what I was doing. And it taught me a valuable lesson, that you can understand a sense of how you're raised and a culture within your own family. It's not perhaps in the sense of culture in a book or a magazine or music. We really didn't have a lot of that in our home. But a different sense of culture, of place, of a family from Ireland or Australia. My father was a great storyteller, as was my mother. And I valued that, and I valued how I raised, but as a young kid, you don't put a lot of faith that it could teach you anything, and you're always looking outside of your own shop for more information and something more solid to hang on to, because you don't trust your own path. But at that time, when I had this critic in my studio, which I'm thankful that I didn't know too much about, I just told my story. And that's what I'll do tonight. I'll try to stay true to my nature and tell my story. And I'm going to tell my story with little stories and experiences that I had. I went to Art Center College of Design and studied illustration, and I got out in 1980. Most of my friends moved to New York City. I moved back to the town that I was trying to run away from. So there I was, back in the same town, managing an apartment building, 34-unit apartment building. And my first daughter, Rory, who is now 37, was just born. So I had these responsibilities of having to care for a family. You know, I would get messages from friends who were in New York, and all of them were single and doing their thing, and I felt I was miles and miles and miles away from anything that I wanted. Of course, I love being a father, I love my children, but the private dreams of a young artist were something else. So there was a day in my storage room in my studio where I had my lawnmower and my supplies that I would fix and paint the rooms. There was a 34-unit apartment building that I had to maintain. Not only did I have to collect rent, which I later found out was important when you have to collect money from your gallerist, I also had to clean the toilets and paint the walls and do everything like that. But there was a moment in my studio, I called it my studio, where I cut out 4 or 5 small drawings that I had made, mostly self-portraits. I cut them out and I put them on the wall in front of me, and I sat down and I said to myself quietly and privately, here I go. It was a private declaration that I was wanting to be an artist. I didn't know where I was going, how I would get there, if I would get there, but I knew I had changed that day, but just by making this private declaration that this is what I want to do. And again, not knowing anything about how to do it, or really not knowing anybody that was doing it. But that's what I felt I needed to do. Attractive, huh? So 4 years after leaving college in 1980, in painting and drawing in my studio that I think I was paying like $300 a month or $100. I think we were sharing a 5,000 square foot studio. This was around 1983. And by that time I was teaching as much as I can, and I was teaching drawing and painting from the figure. And I was illustrating, and that's how I was supporting myself and managing the apartment complex. I was sharing the studio with a friend of mine, Ju Chung, who I had met at Art Center College of Design. So we shared this vast studio. And we're on the roof one evening, or one late afternoon, and I kept asking him, as we're on the rooftop looking across downtown LA, I said, is New York like this? And I was pestering him. Come on, tell me, because he had lived here after college. And he said to me, why don't you just go? And it's one of those moments as if a light went off in my head. And I started to repeat it to myself, why don't you just go? And I started to ask myself, what's keeping me from going to New York? And there was really nothing keeping me at that time, except for perhaps my own fears of what I would do and all that, which is normal. So, a few months later, I think in May of 1984, we both drove out across the country, I think in something like 3 days, and landed in Cliffside Park, New Jersey. And we both rented a small house. He had his own house and he had a young family, and I had, by this time, 2 daughters. And again, I say I'm not a planner, and I'm not. But I was thankful that this house had an attic, because this attic became my studio, and it became just a wonderful place for a young kid to come. And even though it didn't have any insulation and my water would really freeze during the winter, and the summer months were just horribly hot, to me it was paradise. And I was making this transition, and I knew I was making this transition from an illustrator walking around the streets of New York looking for jobs to pay the rent, and trying to paint, and trying to find my voice, or trying to hang on to something with my work that I felt was mine. And it was a long and a hard search for me. So I was illustrating by day and painting by night. And this is the house that we lived on the top floor. And somewhere above the windows, right about there, that little part of the roof was my studio, with 2 little windows on each side that I would look out of. So these are the drawings that I was doing for the New York Times and the Progressive and the Village Voice and things like that. Most of the work was editorial, and it was somewhat political. And I was doing a lot of it, and then I was rewarded, well enough for it to be able to sustain the family. That's what I did at night, in the daytime. And then at night I went up to my studio, climbed up there, and I started to figure out a way that I could start to teach myself to paint. And again, I didn't know anybody. I didn't have painters that I could call upon because I didn't go to grad school. When I studied at Art Center, I was amongst illustrators, and they were on a different path. So I would come to New York with my portfolio in the morning. I would drop it off at one of the numerous magazines in town, and I had this huge portfolio that I would carry around my original illustrations in because I wanted them to see the real thing, not a little transparency. And what the protocol was is that you would drop off your portfolio around 10 o'clock and you'd pick it up in the afternoon. So the day was mine. So I went to museums and I went to galleries and I went to more museums and more galleries, and I was more and more and more confused. And at that time, it was the East Village and Soho were the prominent galleries for young artists to be wandering around. And I'd walk in one and out another and just be so confused and not knowing where I would fit in or what I was attracted to and what I would respond to. And it was difficult, It was difficult, I'm sure, if there's young artists here that are going to school here, to try to find where you fit in and what you have to say, and if you have, and do you indeed have something to say. So it was for me, it was 1984. First I got out of school in 1980, so 1980 to 84 is 4 years, and then from 1984 to 1988, before I was ever showing, was 8 years until I left college, until I started to do some things with my work. It's a long time. I moved to New York when I was 29, and I didn't start showing, I believe, until I was like 33 or 34. And at the same time, there were artists having retrospectives when they were 33 and 34, and I thought, my God, I have no chance of this at all. But I just kept doing this, what I wanted to do, because this is what I love to do. This is the door to one of my studios. I had 3 or 4 studios in my time that I spent in New York. I was here about 10 years. This studio was on 244 Front Street. So I decided yesterday when I woke up that I would visit all the places that I used to live and work in New York to see if in a way that I could find myself in any of these places that I visited. So this is the door. You can see there's a small marking up there that says The Cave. I usually nickname my studios. It was nicknamed The Cave because it had no windows. It had windows in the front that were all busted out but covered with plywood. And that's the metal kind of folding door that I used to crawl through and go back to my little work area and where I was living. And I also arrived at this studio during a difficult time in my life. This was around 1990, 91. I had gone through a separation with my family. My children had moved away. I had started to have some showing with my work and some exhibitions and things like this. So in parts of my life were wonderful, and in parts were extremely, extremely difficult. So standing here yesterday, this is what it looks like now. And in a way you feel, was I ever here? I didn't really feel connected to this place at all, and I had to kind of walk up and down the block to make sure that this is where I've been. And it's not any different for me, for example, when I'm doing an exhibition where I'm bringing in work that I've done 20 or 30 years ago. I'm still looking to try to find myself in the work that I've made. And you start to look at some of the early work that you made, sometimes as a stranger. You know you made it, but you're trying to understand, who was I at that time? What was I thinking about and caring about? And it's an interesting feeling. And sometimes, I've had a couple exhibitions recently where I've had this opportunity to do so. And there is a sense of anxiety right before you open the crate that you're not going to disappoint yourself. That you really want to look at something that you made 20, 35 years ago and know that there was some value and there's something there that's been able to sustain itself. You hope that it starts to add up. And what you're talking about, what you hope that's adding up, is your life. So it was an interesting day yesterday. I must say it was a little depressing in some ways because you're mirroring things of where you were, and I remember I also visited my other studio, which is 11 Worth Street, and I was lost. And I was hitting upon a street, and I go, okay, church, and here's this street. Oh, Worth has to be over here. And I was completely walking in the wrong direction. And then finally I found it. Oh, that's the door. But that's where I used to live. That's where I used to wake up, and I used to know this neighborhood. I used to know the restaurants, just as I used to know those paintings that I made intimately. But now I've become a visitor to them. Yes, I made them, but I can't make them again. You're making something else. So it's interesting always to me when I'm going into the studio, whether it's 20 years, 30 years have passed, or the next day, you're always entering the studio in some way, a different person, and looking for something else. Even though you find similarities in your work, you're looking to be engaged in a different way. You're a different person. You're carrying different thoughts. So this process to me of going into the studio or revisiting the city where I used to live or revisiting a painting that I made before, it's a beautiful experience, but it's always taught me that I have to continually try to trust what I've always trusted. Not to say that I always have the right answers, but that my nature of way of working and risking things, I always have to be able to maintain, so I can always have the possibility of finding something in my work that I can connect to and hang on to, and that can give me a sense of joy, even though the process through it might be difficult to get. To me, there has to be a sense of that in my work, of looking and longing, of trying to reach something that you feel is still out of reach. These are photographs from when I used to live there. This is just a random little picture that I took of some wall in my studio. But there's a picture here of my father sleeping against a haystack. And there's this little black and white picture of me holding my daughter, looking across the Hudson River, I think. But I'm holding her. And those are the types of things that I often try to make paintings about. You know, I work in somewhat of an abstract way, but those are the things that I connect to, these things that exist in my life in very simple ways, and I try to go back to my studio and try to figure out if there is a way that I can in some way touch on that. My daughter's now 35, one of them. She's now a young mother. She's carrying her own child. She has the weight of her child on her body and resting, and I had that at one time with her. And I think about how I can make a painting that touches on that in some way, that has the spirit of that, the feeling of that. Is that possible to do? And when I see paintings that I love and that I'm attracted to and that move me, I'm also trying to look at them and telling myself, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for what that painting has and what that painting holds. And I want to, in some way, try to find that and bring it in my own work. Before I moved to 244 Front Street, I was living on 11 Worth Street with my family and 2 children. I was having some stuff happening with my work, making a little bit of money. And I had tried to repair this marriage with my family, with my wife. So they came back, and in some ways I felt great that I could finally afford to take care of my family what I thought was in the right way. So we had this lovely loft on 11 Worth Street. We had 2 floors of a building. Studio was downstairs. The kids had plenty of room to play. We had a dog. We had all the things that as a young father you want to be able to give your kids. But it didn't work. We had to break up the marriage. The children went back to California, and I went to the cave. A windowless studio full of dust and dirt and no kitchen and only a bathroom, and I had to build a couple walls and call it my home. It was hard. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room that has these stories. I'm not trying to say, I'm just telling my story. One day I came back to my studio, And I said, okay, I got to make this place look a little bit better, so I'm going to paint the floor. So the only paint that I had laying around was this color that I've been using for a long time in my paintings. So I said, I'm going to paint it this off-white color. So as you can see in this photograph, I started to paint the corner of the room, but the floor was so filthy, the cracks so filled with dust, that the paint started to become this sort of dingy gray, and I just gave up. A few days later, I was coming back from teaching. At that time, I was teaching at the School of Visual Arts on 23rd Street. And when I came back and I saw this color in the corner, I felt at home. It felt familiar to me, and something finally in this place started to feel a little bit familiar. So I immediately and instinctively looked around for some scraps of canvas that I had laying around in some other part of the studio, and I laid them in the corner on top of this color that was familiar and left them there. Not this piece that you're seeing, but just scraps of canvas with no wooden support. Maybe a week later or 2 weeks later, I really don't remember that well. But what I do remember, one day again returning to my studio, I stopped and I looked at it, and it looked as if a snake had shed its skin. And I sat there a little uncomfortable with that realization, but in some way felt connected to that possibility that I too can shed my skin, that I too can become someone else. And by what painting allows me is just that I'm able to shed my own skin. I have a way out of myself into something else, into another way of working, another form, another this, but it's permission. I'm always asking for permission, and I've been granted it by other artists and work that I love. If you look at artists, which I think is one of the best schools in the world to go through a museum, and you know what you have to learn. Things measure up quite quickly when you look at great painting, and you know what you have to try to aim for or get close to if you can or if you do. But the mark is set, and you know it, and there's no denying it. And artists have given me this great permission to try things, and to fail, and to try things, and to fail. So I started to feel better in this cave that I was living, and I started to find things slowly in this space that I felt somewhat connected to. And then I started to make these small paintings, and I started to place the paintings on this painted surface. Yes, I could have placed these small paintings anywhere in the room, but for some reason this color just brought them closer to where they needed to be. That's where they needed to be, in this corner that was slightly painted in this color that was familiar, a blanket on a bed, the work as a pillow, I don't know, but that's what it needed to, that's where the work needed to go. And I must say that when I was learning this, teaching myself this, I felt uncomfortable. I wasn't wearing, in a sense, comfortable clothes or shoes. I felt I was in the wrong set of clothes. I was becoming someone else, and I was uncomfortable with it, but my instincts were telling me this is where you need to go. You need to let go of something to find something else. You can always come back, but you never quite come back the same as when I arrived in front of my studio yesterday, and that door where everything has changed since I walked in there last, completely. This small shelf painting, where I painted underneath it, sort of this luminous shadow, this work, in a sense, casting a light from the work onto something else. I started to write these things down that I was doing because I felt, again, as if I was learning a foreign language, and this all was new to me, and I wasn't really telling many people about what I was doing, and I felt a little uncomfortable as I was changing. But I knew I needed to make these small, delicate works where the works were casting shadows, but shadows of light, and they started to introduce other possibilities to me of what a painting can do, and a painting can be, and where a painting can be located, and that a painting can come off its stretcher. It can be on the wall, but it also can be in a corner, and it can be folded, and it can sleep, and it can turn and twist and cut. I wrote a long, long list of the possibilities of what the form could do, and I started to give myself the permission then to try these different things. Not all successfully, of course. these two paintings, that the larger one that's coming out of the wall started as a vertical painting, quite a normal structure for me at that time. It had the depth of about 10 or 12 inches, something like that, and it was maybe 8 feet tall. The smaller work next to it was an older work that had been laying around for quite some time, and it was a painting that I completely physically cut apart. It wasn't intentional. I was just trying to cut off the top 3 inches to change the form of it. But I just kept going. I cut the whole thing apart and then mended it and put it back together. And at the same time, I was looking for a way to bring another way of drawing into my work. And I realized that by cutting these paintings and putting them back together was a way for me to bring drawing that I felt that I was connected to in a way that it felt authentic to me, that I was doing something instead of just mimicking the gesture of another artist or another painting that I had seen. I was desperately looking for a way to bring line into my work. So at this early stage of my work, these things of the permission of cutting the painting, cutting it in half or putting it back together, started to become part of my vocabulary that I've used ever since. The color of my work that I use started before this. It started in probably around 1985, where I went home and I put all my illustrations, I transferred all the images onto a canvas and I painted them away. And I used this color that was close to the color of the canvas, because in a way at that time I wanted to sort of get rid of my path as an illustrator and give myself this permission to fully become a painter. And at that time, if you were an illustrator, you weren't thought of very highly. There was a big division of that time that you were kind of selling out and doing this. So I had a lot of that baggage that I had carried from school into the world of what they call fine art. So on some early paintings, I put all my illustrations down, and I wanted to find something that was a color that was as close to the color of canvas that I could find, and it was this color, this off-white color. I never imagined or thought that I'd be using it still to this day, but that was the reason at the beginning of why I chose to use that color. Okay, I'm jumping around a bit. This is now 1991. In 1989, I started showing my work in Europe, and there were some invitations that were opening up to me. And I was in Luxembourg for a gallery exhibition of my work. And one late afternoon or early evening, I really don't remember that clearly, I'm in the garden of my gallerist, kind of pacing around, and it's still quite chilly and still in the depth of winter. And there was a bird bath, and the bird bath was frozen. And I did a little drawing of it there. You can see there's also a drawing of a tree or something. I don't remember so well what that is. But I remember the bird bath. And that just stuck with me, that this bird bath that would one day, when spring would come, would thaw, and its purpose would come back to life. And this object that was sort of rendered useless would have a life again. And I loved that. And I started to think about how paintings sit in museums and in artist studios, and they're forgotten. And a young artist comes along and they see something in that painting, and they awaken something in it. In a sense, that painting is frozen. But a lot of great painting sits and waits a while for a young artist to come along, and it thaws in their hand, and they take something from that painting and they put it in their own work, and in a way it gives that work that they took this from another life. We all do this. We never make work alone. We always stand on the shoulders of others and look at others to move ahead. We don't do what we do alone. At least I know for sure that I don't. So this stayed with me, this idea of a frozen bird bath. And then I started to introduce some titles into my work. This one is I titled, I Hear the Ice Melting. This one is called Under the Ice. It's a piece of plastic over a painting, and there's a wax hand, and I use wax in my work, not in caustic, but a cold medium wax. And often it's kind of layered and put all over my clothes, and sometimes when I'm sitting in front of a painting and you're looking at what you're doing and trying to figure it out, you're sort of picking this stuff off your gloves and off your pants. And one day I had sort of this wad of wax in my hand, that I had removed from the painting and also from my clothes, and I started rolling it like this, and all of a sudden I had this like little sausage thing that said, oh, that kind of looks like a finger. So over time I made another one and another one and another one, and out of this I made a hand. I said, okay, now I have a hand. What am I going to do with this hand? And then one day the hand just laid around the studio, but one day it drifted into this painting and I covered it with this plastic, and it looked in a way as if it was frozen. It was under this ice. And again, I was thinking of this idea of something frozen, of something waiting to thaw. The piece on the floor is a painting with a chair on it. The painting has since been destroyed, but that's the first painting that I wanted to try to freeze. And I remember telling my wife at the time when I was living in LA, and I was trying to make a freezing painting, I said to her, you know, these things are never, ever, ever going to sell, but I just have to make it. So I found someone to make me this aluminum sort of thing that I could put water in, thinking that was a simple way that I could actually put a painting inside and freeze it. It was a failure. It didn't work at all. And that was around I forget, quite a few years ago. But the painting on the floor is the object that I wanted to freeze. But I kept thinking about it. I kept on thinking about the possibility. And these ideas stay with you in some form, in your back pocket, sometimes buried inside you, sometimes frozen, and sometimes right on the surface. Not always, but often for me, there's another opportunity, another life of a work that has once failed to materialize. But there is always a trigger for me that brings it back to the forefront. And it gives me another opportunity in some way. And I never know what that trigger is. And that's why I return to the studio. Because I believe that many of us have these things buried within us. We just have to allow ourselves in some way to try to bring them out, even if before they've been complete failures. 16 years later, after I sat or stood in that garden of the Luxembourg galleries and I saw that frozen bird bath, I made my first freezing painting. It's small, it's about this size. It's really frozen. It's a painting with ivy on it, under ice, waiting to thaw. I didn't sell it. But that's never the point of making anything. And then I made another one. And then I showed them. That's the detail. 22 years later, after the Luxembourg bird bath, I made a large one. And I thought it would be easy. You know, I made a couple small ones. This one, again, this idea of wanting to jump in the scale and try to figure out if there's a way that I could realize this. I made this painting when I was invited for the Biennale, one Biennale ago. And I had to make, I could make whatever I wanted. But the first thing that came to my mind is I wanted to try to figure out if there's a way that I could make a large freezing painting. But I had to have backup, you know, this very easily could have failed and I wouldn't have been able to realize the complete project. So I had to, you know, convince everybody that was working around me to help me realize this, that let's really try to make this happen. There's a lot of luck involved when I was dealing with something like this, and that's something that I could never have done this alone. And I was helped by a good friend of mine who had the capability I made this in Italy. I was living at that time, where I'm living now, about 3 hours north of Naples. But my good friend, who has an engineering background and has a company where he produces some stuff, put a team together to help me realize the painting. I was able, of course, to control the aesthetics exactly as I had wanted, but it would have been impossible for me to engineer this kind of monster that you find behind the wall of this painting. Now you have to understand that this is not a controlled environment when you're at the Biennale in Venice, and it's a 6-month exhibition in not a climate-controlled space, so there's a lot of risk involved if this thing would just be a failure. But I still, if I wanted to fail, I wanted to fail on my own terms. But it worked. Across from the painting was this painting with light. I have used light for 20 years in my work, but this was, in a sense, in a different form. This is another painting that was in the room, and another painting that was just outside the room, and this is another painting that was in the room. So there's a total of 5 paintings for this project. There were a lot of moments when I was making these paintings that I was really scared. I must say that I felt a certain pressure that I was in such a big exhibition, and whatever that is was what it was. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that it was just a breeze for me. It wasn't. And often, as I do when I'm working on a project, I start to live in my studio. Even though my home was less than 5 minutes away, I slept and lived in the studio. And there were moments late at night when I'm looking at the paintings in their earlier stages, and I realized that they just felt dead to me. There was nothing there. I was working every day, but the paintings were giving me nothing back. It's a scary feeling when you're working on something and you're realizing that there's nothing there. And of course, if you have the luxury of time, you can eventually try to figure it out. I was in town one day and I had picked up, I don't know for what reason, some canes that this man was selling. And I very rarely bring objects into my work that don't come from myself or are connected to me in a way. But these, for some reason, I picked up like 20 of these canes and brought them to the studio. And one night I'm in my studio and I completely took 2 of the paintings that I had started apart. Often I collage and I staple all these canvases, so I just ripped everything off, and it's late at night and I'm just frustrated and I can't see anything. And there's a couple other paintings that were halfway somewhere, and I remember getting one of these canes and just in a fit of anger, just breaking it over my knee. And then I held this broken cane in my hand and I just wrapped some wire around it, and I had this impulse to place it on the painting. And by doing so, it had this little thing coming up like a handle, almost inviting something else to be there. So I placed another cane. And then I sat there looking at this, and there was something there that interested me quite a lot. And it wasn't until like 2 or 3 or 4 days later, maybe not even that long, that I remember this experience when I was with some friends of mine, a collector of mine, Mr. Panza, and his wife, and they both met us at dinner, and they both had walking canes. And I remembered as they took their canes and they put them in the corner of the room, something like this, and the 2 canes just barely touched. I never forgot that. Like I never forgot that bird bath that I saw, like I never forgot when I hung those 4 drawings in the room and I say, "Here I go," or when I said, "I'm shedding my skin." There's some things that I see that I hold, and there's something that will trigger them and they'll bring them out, and it'll start to make sense of what I think I'm trying to do. And when I put this cane on the other cane, it just barely held itself there. This sort of fragile sort of hold that is just so susceptible to falling off. I love the feeling of that. I love what it insinuated to me. And at that moment, I felt I had turned a corner in these works that I was making. And I felt that the works then, after that period, started to have something. And I've been doing this for quite a few years, making stuff. But I'm always learning something. And what I learned by making these paintings is that when the paintings have something, they literally take something from you. And from what they take from you is now held in the painting. Not in every painting I make, or not in every painting you make, or not in every painting de Kooning makes, but it's in some of them. And I really believe that, as strange as it is for me to say that and hear myself saying that, painting takes something from you. And that can be such a profoundly beautiful thing. Like a poem can take something from you. A song can take something from you. But it's also giving something that's substantial and it has this incredible human value. And these are the things that I look for. Even if I'm carrying these ideas with me for 16, 10, 20 years, and there's all these failures in between, sometimes you get lucky and you're able to touch something or do something for yourself that has value. And that's what painting is for me. It gives me a sense of my life that it has value. Not all the other stuff, not selling someone to someone or it going into a collection or whatever. Those are fun things and they're good things and we all like getting them, but that's not what making a painting is about to me. It's something completely different. And when you have those moments, and I must say that they don't happen every day, but that's what calls me back into the studio. I made an exhibition in Norway, and I made an installation inside. But there was a balcony outside that when everyone else was gone, I took a bucket, I got on my hands and knees, and I cleaned it. And then I repainted part of the corner and part of the wall because I wanted to make this space mine. Again, this was a sort of a private act, like I had done before with the pieces of canvas in the corner as if shedding skin. I've realized when I look back that I have these little experiences that I'm trying to teach and give myself something. I'm trying to become someone else by allowing myself to do certain gestures or acts that present myself another possibility of who I can become. And maybe this is what I'm trying to do with my work, is I'm always trying to find a place for it, a home for it, a place that I feel it belongs. And when I give lectures like this, where I look at my slides, things start to make sense. The washing of this balcony, making it my own, is no different than trying to paint that floor and place my painting on it, as if I have found a place, not just the work itself, but myself. And I've realized that this is a large part of what motivates me to what I do, is to try to get to an understanding of who I am, even when most of the time I have no idea. As I was yesterday when I revisited all my studios and home that I lived, and a city that I used to know well, I felt a stranger. But that's no different than looking at paintings that I made in 1984. In a way, I feel like I'm a visitor and an observer of something that I had made, but I really don't remember so well who I was. In 1992, I was invited to Documenta. But before that, I traveled to a small town in the south of Spain. I didn't know where I was going at first, and I asked a young woman on the train where I should go. And she said, "Oh, you must go to this beautiful whitewashed hillside town on the edge of the sea where they grow sugarcane." And I said, "I'll go." And what I was carrying with me was a small suitcase of small paintings that I had made, where I wanted to make these private little installations around the town and leave it there before I went to this big circus to do the same thing, but in a different way. And in a way, they were both the same. And I wanted this experience in a way to be that. So I took with me, I arrived in the town, I walked around, and the next day, there were small little paintings. I was walking by a woman's kitchen window that was open, and I placed it on her windowsill. I placed another on a wall. I placed another in another place, and I took a bunch of pictures, but I couldn't find them in my archive because my archive was all screwed up. But that's what I did. And in the second day, when I was also walking around, I found a pile of children's shoes. And I had the instinct just to pick them up And I knew at that moment when I collected these discarded pile of shoes that I too had to find a home for them. But I had no idea where it would be. I didn't know if I would pack them in my suitcase and they'd come back to New York with me. I just didn't know. Well, the following day when I'm walking around and I found this furrow field, I knew immediately where these shoes had to go. And that's where I placed them, or planted them, or trusted them, that hopefully they could become something else. And again, it was a gesture to teach myself that this is what I have to do. I have to trust that I too, at different times in my life, can become someone else. As uncomfortable as I would feel at the time of doing a gesture like that, because in a way you feel like you're out of your skin. You're someone else. You're changing. And you don't know where it is that you're going or why, but I allow myself these small gestures. And when I look back over the 30 plus years that I've been doing what I've been doing, I have moments like this, alone, privately, where I declare something as I did as a young kid in the managing room of my apartment building, here I go. I always need the possibility to allow myself to go somewhere, and always without the guarantee of knowing where that may be. I was leaving my first exhibition in New York in 1988, and there were some people laughing about the work that I had made. And there was a crate in the doorway leading to the elevator, and the person said, "Oh, you could just put some canvas on that and put some sweat stains on it and it'd be just like the stuff that's inside." And I said, "Sweat stains? That's beautiful. How beautiful. I just love that." And I immediately went and wrote a long list of things about that. If a painting can sweat, then it can have an anxiety, and it can breathe, and it can fold, and it can sleep, and the list went on and on and on. And that was the gesture of someone else, giving me a language that I could use for my work. That I could have a sleeping painting, or a freezing painting, or a page painting, or a stack painting, or a floor painting, or a table painting. And I went on and on and on and have created works in the spirit of this remark. And it was such a wonderful moment for me that I felt that it gave me another door of where I could go. One day I'm in my studio and I'm having a studio visit, and I have these large canvases on the floor, unstretched, that I would often work on before I start to use them on the painting. And I started to fold them because I was having a studio visit. And I folded it like you would fold your winter blanket, put it away when spring comes. And I thought, how beautiful is this, that this painting is folded, that it could one day open up again. And this was before the freezing painting. But it's the same idea, that this painting that you fold, that you sleep, that can be put somewhere, but it can open up again, metaphorically speaking. That nothing is exhausted. It's the human spirit that brings life to things. And if you allow yourself and trust yourself to do this, as unfashionable it may seem at the time, you can keep something alive that you, as the artist, finds value in. So I started to make paintings, sleeping paintings. I started to make paintings with vents in it, as if the painting could breathe. And I started to notice, too, how a folded painting on the floor could change the feeling of it by where you placed it. How it could feel secure in the center of the room, but not so secure if you shifted it towards the door, as if it was going to leave. So the placement of the work became very important to me. It was important before I had made these works, but it reinforced the idea that there's a certain psychology to the placement of a painting, of where it can go and what it can suggest. And this is something that I also adopted for my work and brought into the structure, the frame that I still use today. Grand Salon, New York City. I'm just going to run through this quick, and then if there's some questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them. There's only 3,000 slides, so it shouldn't take long. I must say one thing about this painting. This is a painting with ivy on it that I showed, well, I've shown it several times, but ivy is a material that I've used for quite a long time. And, it's always the question of when you look at a painting, how much do you have to know about it in order to understand it? Do you have to just walk up to it? And that's something that I always kind of grapple with. It's never really something that makes me make a decision, but I do think about it. Because when you use material, sometimes it can go the wrong way in a viewer's head. It's a little risky. This painting was made in Los Angeles on my Pico studio. And there was a little alley that I would pull my car into the back of the studio every day. And there was ivy, this really kind of delicate ivy that was growing on a fence, but it was just bending this chain link fence over, just twisting it and pushing it down. But yet I could go up to this and just sort of pluck off these leaves. So again, I cut a bunch of leaves or vines off of this plant, and I brought them into my studio, and I quickly stapled them to a small painting that I had finished. And it just laid against the wall for 1 month, then 2, then 3, then longer than that. And then I was making with this painting, I thought I was going to make a sleeping painting where I would put another folded painting inside of it, but it just didn't feel right. But there was this empty space asking for something to be placed into it. So I look around my studio, as I often do in those moments, and to try to see if there's something that I can try. And then I saw this painting covered in ivy, and then I put it there and just let it be. And I liked it. At the same time, my father was dying, and he was losing his memory. And I go, oh, of course, that's what it is. That's what this ivy that creeps across this fence and takes it away and takes its form and its character and its image away, and it completely covers it till I can no longer see the fence, and I can no longer see my father or hear my father or understand my father. No one is to know that or expect to know that. So you could look at a painting like this, and it has been looked at as just someone who likes old, dry things. You can't worry about it. You have to allow yourself to go where you have to go, and when it all settles, that's what it is. And that's how that painting came to be for me. And that's where this material, this ivy, became very important in my work. Again, by giving myself the permission to pluck away at the ivy, as I did the scraps of canvas in the corner, when I feel I'm doing something outside of what my normal routine of painting is, and I give myself that permission is always the door to something else. Not always greater, not always better, but something else. And at times it can be better and greater than what I was doing. One quick story, then I'll cut it down. Before I was showing in New York, I entered a show at NYU called Small Works. It was something that was advertised at that time in the Village Voice, and all the works had to be under 12 inches. So I took 2 small paintings like this, and I had dropped them off, and then wait to find out to see what happens. At the same time, I was starting to have a couple people come by my studio because I had written some letters to some other artist, hoping to get some kind of response, because I didn't have the nerve to take my slides anywhere. I was just too shy, and I didn't want to ask the girl to dance, and she says no. But I could write a letter, and they'd never have to answer me, but if they did, then maybe something that way could happen. It was a little safer of a bet. So one artist answered me, and he sent someone around to look at my work. And she was saying, oh, that's really nice, and let me think about it. So 6 months later, after I'm at NYU picking up the 2 paintings that were rejected, and I felt rejected, and I'm walking back from NYU down LaGuardia Place or West Broadway with these 2 paintings in a plastic bag because I didn't want anyone to see them. I decided I'm going to go into the gallery, which is Laurie Rubin Gallery, and I'm going to walk in there and maybe she'll remember me. Oh, there's that artist. I love your work. Here you go. Here's a show. So I walk into the gallery, but before I did that, I didn't want to walk in with a plastic bag. It looked kind of stupid if I had like stuff with me. So I opened the door that led down to the basement, and I put the 2 little paintings there, and I walked up to the gallery, and as many of us young artists have done, you sort of just walk around. I don't even remember what the show was. I saw her sitting at her desk on her phone. She didn't even have a clue who I was. I walked back downstairs to get my paintings and go home, feeling doubly rejected, and the door was locked. And I didn't have the guts to ask anyone to open it. So they probably threw them away, a couple paintings tossed away. But we all have moments like that. I still have moments like that. I've done some great things. I've worked with some great people. I'm in some great collections. But there's still tough days where you have to say, okay, the door is locked, but I'll find another one to open. But the opening of the door and the possibility of the door open, you have to give this to yourself, and you can't wait for it to be open. And that's one thing that I've learned, and that's one thing that I enjoy when I give these talks, because if there's a young artist here or an older artist here, if it can resonate in some way with them, that they too have to go back and open their door, that I've done my job. And that's the gift for me of having been invited, is to do that. It's not to sit here and to hear myself blah, 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 because I do that every day at the cafe to my wife. She's heard these stories over and over and over and over and over again, and I have too. But in reality, there's some truth to all our struggles, that we can connect to others in a certain way. And I'm thankful in my life that I have painting as a way to try to figure out, as I started this lecture, where am I going and who am I? Before there's questions, I just want to do one thing. I had a good friend of mine who made books. I have 2 friends, actually, that make beautiful books. And it inspired me for about 6 or 7 years ago to start making a newspaper, something that I would self-publish. And I laugh to my friends because I say I'm a newspaper publisher, but I'm not a distributor, because I think I've made now 13 or 14 newspapers, and I make an edition of 2,000, and I have most of the 2,000 in my storage. But I love making them. I love making them. And I usually make them at the end of a work cycle before a show, and I usually print them, take them to the gallery, design them on my computer, usually in like 1 or 2 days, and this still feeding off of that energy of the studio time. But it was also a way for me to start to try to understand my work and to try to put something out there that maybe others can understand my work. In a way, doing forensics. No different than yesterday, the day before, if I go to a museum somewhere and I'm looking at, in the modern, I'm looking at the Red Studio by Matisse, or if I'm looking at the Moroccan, and I'm trying to understand how he painted it, and I still can't figure out how he was able to do that. And that mystery, and you're always looking for clues that the artist leaves you long after they're gone to try to figure out who they were. Not who you're told they were, but who they were. And some of that lives within the painting. Making newspapers for me has allowed me again to become a bit of a different person, expose a different side of me perhaps, and again to try to give myself permission to do certain things that I really feel I need to do. I'll show you one very quickly, and then we'll be done. They're usually 48 pages. They're in color. They're newspapers, so it's kind of a crapshoot of what you can get. And always when I'm in the studio, I'm taking pictures and I'm making notes and I'm just piling it here or in my computer, and then at the end of that work cycle of a year or 2 years or 6 months, whatever it is, I try to make sense of it in some way by things that have remained sort of littered around my studio and put them in a newspaper. This was made right after for my exhibition that I had in Bologna. And another wonderful thing about making the newspapers is it's something that you don't have to wait for the bus to show up. You do it yourself. You open your own door. And they're good Christmas presents, or you can like wrap stuff in them. And they're just a joy to make. And I only collaborate with one person with these newspapers, and it's a poet friend of mine. And it's a joy, just a joy to do that. If you see the photograph of these children at the museum, at the Mambo Museum in Bologna, they have a great activities with children. And I walked in one day, I was walking through my show with someone, I saw all these kids making work influenced by what I had made, and you can see they put it against the wall, and they were talking about it. And I was an observer to this. And again, I had the instinct to take one of my paintings off the wall, to walk over there, and to put my painting with theirs. And that's what I did. I took a small box, put it on the floor, and joined the group because I wanted to be a part of something. No different than I was a young kid and I wanted to show with great artists because I wanted to be a part of something. Thank you very much.